Alright guys, my name is Goblin, and today we're going to be counting down the top 5 hardest raid bosses coming in Naxxramas. So in the community there's this belief that because Naxxramas was tuned in symbiosis with patch 1.12 talents, that the raid will actually be somewhat challenging, or at least significantly more difficult than the previous raid tiers. Obviously only time will tell, but what is certain is that Naxxramas will be very demanding on players, particularly their back pocket, because the consumable requirements for Naxxramas will make the Thaddius from AQ40 look like a cheap boss, and that's mainly where the difficulty of Nax actually lies. It's in the week to week preparation more than the actual boss mechanics themselves. Nonetheless, there is a number of bosses in Naxxramas that do require a serious level of coordination, otherwise you won't get very far. You can't just tank and spank cheese your way through this raid. Every member of the raid will require a couple of brain cells, because you can't just rely on your raid leader, tanks and healers to carry the raid. Just before we jump in guys, appreciate if people did quickly subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, because that really does help out. But anyway, let's jump in. The first big challenge of coordination your raid will face will be the 4 Horsemen. Just a quick FYI guys, I use my own Wrath of the Lich King private server to get footage for my videos, which is why the bosses and mobs may look a little different to the actually did in vanilla, because I am in fact using the post Wrath of the Lich King version of the raid. What's unique about this fight is that it has the biggest tanking requirement in the history of World of Warcraft, because the fight actually does need 8 tanks. Yes, 8 tanks. All preferably warriors, very well geared, and resistance gear is also needed. In total there are 4 bosses to deal with, as you've probably worked out, each of their own unique abilities. First of all we have Mograine, who is the hardest hitting, who will have to be tanked by your beefiest tanks with at least 200 fire resistance points. This is because he has a 25% chance on his melee attacks to proc the corrupted Ashbringer's ability Righteous Fire for hits for 2100 to 2700 fire damage, with a dot of 4800 damage. Secondly, we have Thane Kel'Thuzad, who summons a giant meteor on a random target within 20 yards that deals 14 to 16,000 damage, so players will have to stack up to split that damage between everyone. Thirdly, we have Lady Blamu, who summons void zones to random players that deal 3,500 to 4,500 damage per tick. This means 2 ticks will kill most players, so you have a second and a half to jump out of it in time. And lastly we have Sir Zeliek, who deals a wholly damaging spell similar to Chain Lightning, although the more players it hits, the more damage it deals, so players have to make sure to spread out by 10 yards. This mechanic essentially makes it impossible for melee to go anywhere near this boss. But the main difficulty of this boss doesn't actually allow their individual abilities, but the marking mechanics. Basically, every boss puts a mark on a player within 70 yards that is a stacking dot that ramps up damage very quickly. Our 4 marks, for instance, it would deal 5000 shadow damage per tick, which is obviously totally unbearable. And on top of this, it will actually half the amount of threat you deal per stack, which means tanks will obviously have issues with other DPS pulling threat. And the debuff lasts a whole 75 seconds, so you can't just jump out of range for a few seconds like you can on Firemore. You have to run into the centre of the room and just sit and chill until the stacks go down before you can proceed to another boss. This also means there is a huge amount of coordinated rotations to be made. Tanks have to tank swap each boss, healers and DPS have to rotate around the room, in and out of a safe zone, in the middle of the room, and all in all the fight requires a serious amount of communication and perfect timing. Otherwise players are just going to get slowly rotted down by the marks. Secondly, we have Loatheb, a boss that makes your healers redundant since they can only cast 1 beneficial spell every 1 minute. This means there is very little healing ever actually happening in this fight, so DPS and tanks have to rely on their own resources in order to stay alive, for instance consumables, bandages and things like that. So the melee will have to survive a poison aura debuff he inflicts that causes 196 nature damage every 6 seconds. On top of this, every 30 seconds he also casts Inevitable Doom that deals 2550 shadow damage to the entire raid, and this damage can't be resisted or the debuff removed, and that's where your shadow protection potions come into use. This means the longer you're in this fight, the harder it becomes to stay alive, so the fight is a huge DPS test on the raid. But luckily there is a mechanic that can help you increase the DPS called Fungal Bloom. That is a small ad that spawns, and when killed buffs a total of 5 people close by to when it dies 50% increased melee crit chance and 60% increased spell crit chance, and all spells and abilities cause 0 threat, and it lasts a total of 90 seconds. But it is absolutely essential that you rotate all of your DPS groups in to get this buff, otherwise you simply will not kill the boss fast enough, especially if it's hefty, big health pool. On top of all this, Loatheb decurses all decurses on himself every 30 seconds, so Warlocks will have to be on the ball to refresh them. Thirdly, we have Sapphiron, an undead frost dragon and the second to last boss in Naxxramas that required every member in the raid, apart from maybe tanks, to bring a decent amount of frost resistance gear. Because if you don't have enough, you are just toast, because you'll probably last about a minute before you die. This is because the boss deals 600 frost damage to everyone in the raid every 2 seconds. Yes, every 2 seconds this hefty debuff is ticking away on everyone. He also summons a blizzard that drifts around the boss room that deals 3000 to 4000 damage per tick, while also slowing the player, so if you get caught in this blizzard and didn't react fast enough, you were dead. The boss also has a life drain spell that can affect a number of players at once and will in fact heal the boss, so mages and druids have to decurse it fast enough, otherwise the boss will just start gaining health back. During phase 2, Sapphiron will fly into the air and cast ice bolts at random players in the raid that deal 2600 to 3400 damage with a splash effect of 10 yards, which is why it's recommended to stay 10 yards apart from everyone of the raid at all times, and it will also encase that player in an ice tomb. Now, the ice tombs are used by other players to line of sight his next ability called Frost Breath that will instantly kill anybody it hits within line of sight. So the entire raid has to hide behind 5 ice tombs to deal with this ability, providing that 5 people manage to survive the actual ice bolt damage because their health pool was topped up, you know, to actually turn into an ice tomb. This is a very healing intensive fight, and it is recommended to bring 14 to 16 healers when progressing on this boss. To put that in perspective, most raids on retail run with about 15 people, so you have to bring an entire retail raid just of healers to this boss. Next we have Thaddius, a World of Warcraft's version of Frankenstein the size of a titan, made from the bodies of women and children harvested by the Scourge. Technically there are 3 bosses on this fight, since you have to defeat the abominations on the east and west platforms of the room before you can in fact jump down to the boss. These bosses, Stalag and Fugan, will knock the tanks over to the other platform every 20 seconds, so everyone needs to be focused during that tank transition not to over aggro. Stalag will gain a powerful buff randomly that increases his attack damage by 200% for 8 seconds, and every single melee hit that doesn't get avoided will be a crushing blow. So if a warrior forgets to put shield block up for about 1 second, he's probably going to die. Once these 2 mini-bosses are dead, the raid can finally jump down to Thaddius, who immediately applies the negative or positive charge debuff, evenly split between everyone in the raid. Anyone who stands within 10 yards of somebody with an opposite charge will suffer 2000 nature damage every 5 seconds, so it only takes about 3 people to be stood incorrectly for half of the raid to just be instantly killed. Once everyone has figured out the mechanics, the boss is actually pretty easy, but the reason it can be so difficult is because everyone, and I mean everyone, has to do the fight absolutely perfectly. You will also have to kill the boss within 5 minutes, otherwise he will simply just kill the entire raid, but luckily he also applies a damage buff to 19 people in the raid of 10% extra damage for a total of 190% extra damage. And lastly we have the Lich Kel'Thuzad, the final and last boss of Naxxramas. When you enter the room you won't in fact have to deal with the boss for a full 5 minutes, because you will be surrounded by a small undead army who continuously attack you in waves with many deadly abilities. Firstly you have the Soul Weavers, a spectre who deals 6300 damage to 8600 to anybody within melee range, so basically an instant kill. Therefore these mobs had to be quickly killed by the ranged DPS before they actually reached the raid. Then there are the soldiers who have a similar ability but deal 2500 to 3100 damage, so essentially there are 2 kind of mobs that are essentially a walking time bomb that can quickly wipe the raid if they aren't killed fast enough before they reach the raid. And lastly we have the abominations that have to be tanked because of their high health pool and DPS by the melee. They also deal very high melee damage, and they also apply a debuff called Mortal Wound that reduces the healing received by the tank by 10%, and this obviously stacks up, which means there has to be a cheeky tank swap in order to get those mobs down. Finally, after dealing with an undead army, Kel'Thuzad will engage in combat. His first ability is a one-shotting frostbolt ability that is dealt to random players in the raid that deals 9,000 to 11,000 damage per hit. Fortunately, this can be and has to be interrupted every single time it is cast. He also does a frostbolt volley to everyone in the room that hits for 2,700 to 3,500 damage per hit. Every minute KT will mind control the main tanks and 4 other players who will randomly attack any other raid member for huge damage. These mind control people will have to be crowd controlled and the main tank swapped. A very unwelcome ability for anybody who has mana is the Mana Detonation ability, which is a debuff that is applied to a random raid member who has mana and will deal AoE damage equal to that player's mana pool, which can be quite high if your deck's out in full AQ gear, while also cutting his mana pool in half. So that is a big kick in the King's Jewels. So whoever has this debuff obviously has to quickly jump out of the raid. Another lethal ability was Frost Blast, that deals 150% of a target's health over 5 seconds, applied to a random raid member that can also chain to any other player within 10 yards. The only way to deal with this ability is for a healer to out-heal the damage. There is an also instant kill ability called Shadow Fissure, although it is quite easy to deal with because you have a total of 3 seconds to get out of it and it's very visual. If you're not paying attention, it will instantly kill you. And the last thing you have to deal with are the Ice Crown Guardians. 5 of them will spawn in total when KT is at 40% health. Luckily 3 can be shackled, but try and shackle more than 3 and KT will break the shackles. The 2 remaining obviously have to be tanked, but if a member of the raid dies or the Guardian swaps their target, they gain an increasingly more powerful buff that increases their damage by 15% while also increasing their size. So as you can probably imagine, this was a very long and difficult fight that could easily stretch for over 10 minutes, which is extremely difficult for healers to deal with if they got bad RNG, because of that, mana detonation mechanic that could cut their mana pool in half. If anybody lost focus for more than a second, the raid members would very quickly begin to drop like flies to high damaging abilities that would chain up to more players, or allow the Guardians to stack up too much of their buff to the point where they just begin stampeding the raid. Anyway guys, that is the end of the video there. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. But anyway, my name is Medigoblin. To my next video, ciao.